Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. This video is going to be, I think, a little bit of an unusual one, so let me start by saying this is kind of a mid-month wrap-up, but it isn't going to include all of the books that I have read up until this point because I am reading a bunch of Shakespeare and Shakespeare-related books for Shaktember, and I have decided that I want to do a separate wrap-up video for my Shaktember reads where I kind of share my thoughts a little bit more in depth and kind of focused, since my TBR for that is all sort of thematically linked together. The reason why I'm filming kind of a mid-month wrap-up now is because next week, at the time I'm filming this, is going to be the start of the Jewish high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are like very holy days for fellow Jews, and I'm going to be very busy with holiday celebrations and plans and things like that. So I kind of wanted to get this video filmed and edited and out, partially because I'm not going to have time to do it next week, and then also because I probably am not going to have a ton of reading time then either. So, that being said, this is going to be a kind of a mixed bag of a reading wrap-up, and I'm going to just share a couple other fun things that I got to do bookish recently. First up, I got to attend my first ever Baltimore Book Festival. I went with my husband and one of my friends from work. We had a great time. It's basically set up kind of like a block party, so a bunch of city blocks are roped off to traffic, and it's all just very pedestrian focused. There's a bunch of tents set up where there are stages for authors to do readings and book talks and things like that. And then there were also a lot of different bookshops, like local indie bookshops selling their books, a couple like local authors or people that make their own zines, people that make like bookish arts and crafts where they're selling their stuff. And there were a lot of like community organizations too, like the typical like register to vote people, but then also the like Chesapeake Shakespeare Company, which is really interesting to me because I knew about them, but I haven't actually been to see a play with them, and I think I'd like to try and get that done if possible before I have my baby later this year, because once there's a baby, it's going to just be a little bit more difficult to go to see live theater. So I did buy 2 books at the book festival. One of them was because I wanted to have it signed, and that was Charlie Jane Anders' new novel, Lessons in Magic and Disaster. She is one of my favorite authors of all time, and I have already started reading this book. It's kind of a literary, witchy, very queer, very trans story. We're following Jamie, who is a PhD student, trying to write her dissertation on 18th century literature. She is also trans, and she is trying to help her mom, one of her moms, who is grieving the death of her second mom many years in the past, and she's trying to help her kind of process this grief by teaching her how to do magic. I am just under 100 pages into this book. I am loving it so much so far. Charlie Jane Anders actually released in her email newsletter kind of a discussion of this novel and the genre of dark academia, and that being in conversation with A.S. Byatt's novel Possession, which is not, I think, what most people would consider dark academia, but I am interested to read that newsletter once I'm a little bit farther into this book, and just to see kind of what she's thinking about in terms of the like literary, almost detective story that's happening in that book. So it was really awesome. She was very kind and just talked with us at the tent, signed the book, made little like cat drawings in there, and I'm thoroughly enjoying reading this so far. The second book that I bought from one of the indie bookstore tables, and this is one of my most anticipated releases this year, and that is The Magician of Tiger Castle by Louis Sachar. He is really well known as a children's author. He wrote the book Holes and the Sideways Stories from Wayside School series. The Wayside School books were my husband's favorite books when he was a kid, and we kind of revisited them during COVID and would just like read those aloud as like a way to feel a bit comforted and laugh out loud and relieve stress and stuff. But this is Louis Sachar's first ever book written for adults, and obviously it's a fantasy story. That was kind of all I really needed to know, and I haven't started it yet, but I am definitely going to finish reading this book before the year is up. Okay, so I did want to share another thing that has been kind of occupying my time. Like I said, I'm going to be having a baby later this year in December, and I've been spending a little while working on a crochet project. So I actually made some tiny little booties, a small hat with little strings attached, and this little sweater for crochet. This was a lot of fun to work on for this project. I am a big crocheter, but I had kind of like fallen off of it when summertime came around, just because it's really hard to like sit and crochet with something on your lap when it's really hot outside, because it does warm you up. Like, that's a project that's kind of difficult to do when it's really sweltering outside. But I found a pattern that I really liked. I'll share it in the description just in case you're interested. It's not, like an affiliate link or anything. And I used this ice cream yarn, which is the Lion brand. I got this years ago at Joann's for a project, and now finally I'm getting to use it. Baby related project. And I think I'm debating, I'm going back and forth on if I'm going to actually like sew these little buttons onto it or not. They're basically little bluebirds, and they're like painted with little curly Q designs, and I think they're cute. So we will see, but that was a lot of fun. That definitely took me overall like maybe about a month to finish all of these, especially if we're like calculating in the time that it took for me to like research the patterns and all of that stuff. But that was fun, and that's kind of like what else I have been doing that's not bookish related recently. So I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping up the books. We have such a spread this month. So I have everything from 5 stars to DNF to crushing disappointment to it was just okay. It's kind of all over the place. So I think I'm actually going to start with the DNF and then kind of go from the stuff I liked the least and kind of end on a high note with what I liked the most. So unfortunately, my first DNF for this month was the short story collection Eyes, Guts, Throat, Bones by Moira Fowley. This was on my sort of spooky season TBR because it is a queer horror short story collection. This author has written young adult lit before, and this was her first collection for adults. And I just could not get on with it. I couldn't get on with the writing style, or honestly, just like both the prose and the content of the stories themselves were just not compelling at all. I did read like 3 different stories. It is set up as like 4 categories, one for each of the words in the title. And it's interesting because the table of contents does have you, it suggests, I guess, that you're reading this out of order, because the first story doesn't start on page 1, it starts on page 63, and then we go to 115, 239, and then only with the 4th story do we go back to page 1. I tried out 3 different stories here and really just didn't gel with any of them, so I'm going to pass this book on, and hopefully somebody will enjoy reading it more than I did. But yeah, that was a DNF. Too bad. And then we have 3 books that I rated 2 stars. So the first one of those, I mean, this is going to come kind of with a caveat because it is a bit of an older title. So some of the reason why I rated it 2 is because I wouldn't necessarily recommend you read it now, but I think it probably was like a better read when it was more timely when it came out. And that book is The End of Education, Redefining the Value of School by Neil Postman. This was published first in 1995. So this is a 30-year-old book at this point. And it's got kind of a tongue-in-cheek title where it's like the end of education. The education system, specifically public school in the United States, is undergoing a significant change in the 90s. And this is kind of Postman's observations about the end, the double meaning of education, being like, what is the point or the purpose of education? In this book, he argues that the purpose of public education is to create the public itself. and that the public school system is kind of moving away from this project of making citizens, so to speak. And he's worried that the public school system and the education system more generally is moving towards a sort of consumer-based model where the students are seen more as customers than as people that are just like studying to become more well-rounded or educated or better like participants in our society. So he kind of outlines a lot of his critiques of these sort of, he calls them gods, but really they're sort of like myths or stories we tell ourselves about education, and then suggests a couple like things that we could replace these sort of old gods with. Stuff like a model of education that is more humanistic and planet-based and species-based, a model of education that kind of teaches students about things more so like by project-based or hands-on learning or things like that. And it's like the ideas in here are interesting. They weren't particularly new to me, especially because this is like my profession. So I think and read a lot about this as well as kind of do it every day. But one of the things, I mean, the main thing, I guess, that frustrated me about this book is that I just didn't think a lot of his points were argued as well or as clearly as they could be. And I think that's kind of a shame because, yes, some of these points that he's arguing, you know, clearly history took a very different turn or something. Like the outcome of changes in education policy was different than what he anticipated. But particularly with regards to his arguments about like the role of multiculturalism in the classroom, I thought that those were not particularly well argued or convincing. He basically says that public education is sort of to create a more unified or homogenous public, and that while we have like diversity present kind of just as a fact in our student population, he argues that it isn't the job of the public school system to sort of be responsible for education in terms of like minority cultures or history or anything like that. He says that's sort of the domain of the home and the student's family. And I think what he's trying to get at with some of his criticism is a criticism of like what becomes identity politics, where like your identity with the group kind of just excludes any other sort of growth in your political consciousness or your political activity. But it isn't argued particularly well. It's argued very clumsily in a way that makes it seem like he's arguing against diversity in the classroom, which again, I don't think he is, but I also think that there is a better way to incorporate, for instance, teaching the history that diverse groups have brought to the United States. Like, I do think we should be teaching things like queer history, Black history, disability history, and whatnot in the classroom, not to be tokenistic, which I think is what he's kind of arguing it for, and certainly not to, you know, make anybody feel ashamed because they're not part of a particular group. He does kind of bring up, there's like a conservative politician in Florida in the 90s who's saying, well, if we teach Black history in schools, then white kids will be ashamed to be white. And I'm just sitting here shaking my head in 2025 going, oh, it's about to get so much worse. So obviously, like, neither he nor I, like, agree that that should be the purpose of diversity in education. But I also just think that, like, part of why I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book now is because the state of education has kind of changed so radically, and there's been a lot of work done in the last 30 years to kind of come up with these like alternative pedagogical techniques or, you know, ways of teaching. Like, for instance, I mean, a lot of the things he recommends in here, I still really don't know how those would be implemented in the public schools as they are right now. And he doesn't really offer any advice for that. He just sort of says, well, this is what we should do. Kids should do project-based learning. It's up to the teachers and the local governments to figure out what that looks like. And I sometimes have difficulty if there's no sort of imagination of what that could look like, because I teach in a sort of alternative type school where the learning is very hands-on and experiential and project-based, and it does not look like a sort of typical sit down at a desk for 6 hours school environment. So it's not that the book was bad, it's just that I wouldn't necessarily recommend you read it now. I think that just some of it is dated and there's not enough in there that you can't get from more current sources that will then, I think, be a little bit more useful to you as you read the book. But there we go. All right. Talked about that for longer than I thought I would. The next 2-star book on my list was the genre book club pick for this month, and that was Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton. This was recently, like earlier this year, made into a movie titled Mickey 17. Same kind of idea, but it is directed by Bong Joon-ho, who directed Parasite. I really enjoyed the movie, even though I thought the plotting of it was very shaggy at times and the pacing kind of falls apart towards the end. So I was interested to see like what the similarities and differences were going to be between the movie and the book. And I have to say, the promise of this book was much stronger early on, but then it kind of doesn't really go anywhere with the momentum of the philosophical questions it poses. So Mickey 7 is this sort of expendable character on a generation ship that is going out and trying to find like a new home for humanity in space. He is the crew's expendable, which basically means in this world they have the technology to create clones of people and then like upload their consciousness to the clone. And the reason that they need one of these on the crew is that he's basically a guinea pig for anything that is too dangerous for people with a more important job to be able to do. And he's also kind of the guinea pig for any time they crash land on a new planet to go out and see, you know, does he get sick from some sort of germ that's there? Can he breathe the atmosphere? So he is very like socially ostracized because of this. And there's also like a whole religious movement in this world that it's kind of like fetishizing him. At the same time, the rest of society mostly like reviles the expendables or the clone characters because of an incident where somebody abused that technology and used it to become a serial killer. So things are not looking great for him because he's constantly dying and getting reprinted. And kind of the premise of this book is that, you know, he is supposed to die but not be reprinted until after the previous Mickey dies, because there's a big taboo against there being multiple clones out at the same time. So the story begins with Mickey 7 near death, but he actually manages to rescue himself. But what he doesn't know is that one of the other crew members has actually called in to report his death, so the station has already printed Mickey 8, which is identical copy to him, but now there are two of them, and shenanigans ensue as they kind of try to figure out how they're gonna make this work without tipping anybody off to the fact that there are two. This book was tough for me because on the one hand, it is kind of a breezy sci-fi story. It's not a hard read, like you could just breeze through it really quickly. But I do like when sci-fi like posits philosophical questions that it interacts with those questions meaningfully. Like, are 7 and 8 the same person? They have completely different consciousnesses. That doesn't really go anywhere in terms of its exploration. We learn early on that Mickey's a historian, and it seems like that's going to provide like a unique perspective for him when it comes to this colony. But that also never really goes anywhere. And I think like this is another frustrating thing for me, is that so many things just become too easy, and that makes it like a boring read, to be honest. I think a lot more of the story was successful when Mickey was sharing his research and his thoughts about like previous human colonies that had failed or succeeded on other planets. But as a character himself, he's just kind of bland and boring, and there's a few other characters that are on the station with him, and they're all just kind of flat. I don't know, like this just, the writing and the quality of like the plotting itself didn't really live up to the premise, unfortunately. So I gave it 2 stars. I'd recommend it to the right reader, but it, you know, it wasn't really for me. Next, I am sorry to say, is going to be probably the biggest reading disappointment of the year this far for me. This was another book that I gave 2 stars. I wouldn't really recommend this at all. And that was Catabasis by R.F. Kuang. I am so disappointed that I did not like this book because I really loved Babel. I liked Yellowface a lot. But R.F. Kuang, I think at this point, this is her 6th novel. And I think at this point, I would have expected a writer of her caliber and of her intellect to have developed her craft somewhat more, and she just hasn't. So what is this book about? This is about a graduate student named Alice who goes to Oxford University, and this is a world where she and her fellow graduate students study magic, which is kind of this, it's almost like a pure math or a pure logic type graduate program where they can create magic by drawing these chalk sigils that highlight the logical inconsistencies or contradictions in the world, and then they can use that to kind of manipulate reality. Anyway, she winds up having a moment where she sends her terrible graduate thesis advisor to the depths of hell, and then she winds up feeling guilty about it and goes on a quest, like a journey to the underworld to get him back. And she is followed by Peter, who is another graduate student, who it's implied pretty early on that the two of them had some, like, they could have had like a really good romantic relationship with each other, but some of that fell apart due to the extremely competitive nature of their graduate programs and some of the ensuing paranoia they have that the other one is just trying to get close to them to upstage them. So that's kind of the setup. These two PhD students going to hell to get back the soul of their professor. It was so promising because it promised to engage with a lot of different literary traditions about hell or the underworld. Not just like Greek and Roman classical mythology, but the writings of like modernists, of Dante, of course, of different sort of like traditional Chinese mythology texts, which I'm not familiar with, but I did do some reading after or as I was finishing this book. And we kind of went through it. And this is just another book where the ideas are there, but the execution just really, really suffers. I think one of the things that really frustrated me about this book is that it is supposed to be a critique of academia and the sort of exploitative nature of the academy when it comes to how it treats graduate students. I do have some limited experience with this. I was in a PhD program for a while and I wound up leaving it because of a variety of different reasons, but one of those was that I just didn't really want to participate in the system at the academy anymore. So some of these critiques of the academy rang pretty true. But I think the problem is that the book really just stops short of ever actually going hard enough to say, and this is why we need a change here, or we need to dismantle this system that is allowing professors or other people who are bad actors to get away with manipulating or being abusive towards their graduate students. And I think it's because the book just kind of always has the characters fall back on riding on the prestige of having made it this far by getting into a PhD program at Oxford in the first place. And they have this, such a self-destructive impulse to want to stay in the program, no matter the costs, no matter all the other things they're trying to do to get out. So on the one hand, I feel like the critique was being either like fought with or just undermined by this insistence below the critique, below the conscious level of the critique, on returning to the status quo, on preserving the prestige and power of these like elite colleges and universities and institutions. On a writing level, I had a lot of difficulty with the plotting and pacing of this book. This is literally supposed to be about a journey to the underworld. Everything is far too easy for the protagonist. We keep hearing about how hard this is going to be, how much struggle and suffering is going to be involved, and nothing really ever is that hard for the protagonists to pull off. They're pretty much able to use magic as much or as little as they want to. The interpersonal conflict is very much waved away. The sort of development of the romance between Alice and Peter is tepid at best, and at worst really pushing it. one of the things that really annoyed me about this book is that I kind of feel like R.F. Kuang was writing self-insert fan fiction of Dante's Divine Comedy, like the Inferno specifically, because it's clear that like she is definitely putting a lot of her own personal experience into the character of Alice, which is fine. This is normal for authors to write about or be influenced by their personal experience. But Peter is so poorly drawn, and I wound up finding out that a lot of the things that sort of are contrived to cause conflict between the two of them are also like a one-to-one correspondence with the author's husband in real life. His name is also Peter. He is also a mathematics student at MIT, even down to sort of this manufactured conflict that is because Peter, the character, is hiding the fact that he has Crohn's disease from Alice and the other students. There's a lot that could have been done about discussing internalized ableism and the way in which the work culture and the culture of the academy in the United States really just punishes you if you ever need to take time off for health or personal reasons, because there's this idea that your personal life will always take a backseat to your research. And then I found out that R.F. Kuang's husband in real life, Peter, also has Crohn's disease. And I'm just like, okay, so there's a character that is very similar to you, a character that at every superficial level is nearly identical to your husband. This romance and the conflict that is involved in it is just like not convincing whatsoever. We are told how hard this journey through the underworld is, but the characters never really kind of grow or change as a result of the hardships they face, and I think that's partially because they overcome them too easily. We keep hearing how Alice's attitudes towards her professor and learning more about like the bad things that he has done that, you know, got him sent to hell in the first place. And I kept hoping that this was going to kind of provoke a change in mind, or at least an attitude, when it comes to what Alice decided to do. But she is functionally the same character at the end of a 500-page book than she is at the beginning. There is not really any growth or development or anything like that. This book also seemed much more concerned with the characters sort of dumping how well-read they were or sharing esoteric bits of knowledge that, again, I couldn't quite help but think, is this just the author showing off the amount of research and other primary sources she has read to write this book? Because I don't doubt for a minute that this woman, who is very brilliant and, you know, has degrees from Ivy League and like Oxbridge universities, is very well read. I don't doubt that for a second. But sort of just interrupting the plot or the pacing of a novel to insert a lot of exposition about what Plato said about the afterlife, or what a certain like logician had to say to interpret Zeno's paradox, is not good writing when it's not then in service of the story you're trying to tell. So I feel like the sort of reading list, for lack of a better word, or the bibliography that went into the research and writing of this book is really fighting with this book as a work of fiction. And I think it actually causes it to just get bogged down, and this really fails as a work of fiction, I think. I did read some reviews that people had written of this and then Babel as well, and it seems that there were others that had some similar criticisms of Babel. I still think that like the character development in Babel and the plotting and pacing were much better than this book. This book just was overwhelmed with, I think, its own inertia, and that made it just really not a good reading experience, and I don't think a very good book. So I was very disappointed by this. I could say more about this, but I think I'm going to move on. Mari from My Name is Marinez had a really good sort of short form review that she posted over on her Instagram, so I will try and find the link to that and leave it below if you're interested. I thought that she had some really insightful things to say in her review of that. And again, that was, more of a first impressions kind of informal review. But I agreed with a lot of the points that she made in there too. And I know that I'm in the minority. People really seem to love this book. So do with that what you will if you're trying to decide whether you want to read it or not. Okay, moving on. We have the second book that I started for the spooky, autumn reads TBR, and the first one that I actually finished, and that was We Have Always Lived at the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I gave this book 3 stars, which for me is it was good. I would probably recommend this to most people. That this is a very weird book. It is the story of these 2 sisters, Mary Catherine, who goes by Mary Cat, and Constance, and their uncle Julian, and they are the 3 survivors of a poisoned family meal where allegedly Constance poisoned the entire family's dinner, and all of them died except for her sister, and Julian. And ever since then, they have kind of been living together in this Gothic, spooky old house in their little New England town. The neighborhood tongues have wagged. They're definitely objects of both fear, but curiosity and scorn. And so this is kind of a Gothic story about what it's like being so heavily scrutinized by your neighbors when you're living in a small New England town. This is a very weird and bizarre book to read. And I will say, this is a book that I read because it's a Gothic classic, but I think it's actually my least favorite book of Shirley Jackson's that I've read. I think I respect what she's trying to do here more than I actually like to read it. And that could also be because a lot of the Gothic twists and turns of this book I saw coming pretty early on. So they weren't really particularly surprising or thrilling to me because I was oh, it's obvious that here is a person who is responsible for insert thing here. It's very spoilery, but when you can figure it out that much earlier on, it just didn't make for a particularly emotive reading experience for me. The writing is also very, very much if you got sort of deep in the weeds and inside the head of a character who has a lot of anxieties, paranoia. If you were going to pathologize it, you might even say agoraphobia, just extreme fear of leaving the house and having to encounter anybody else. And it does make for a very uncomfortable and unsettling reading experience, but it's also it's just bizarre to the degree that I find myself completely alienated from all 3 of these characters. And that could be the point, that could be the sort of artistic point. And I think the main character, Mary Cat, is supposed to be sympathetic to a degree, but I didn't really find that to be the case at all. I mostly just felt so uncomfortable reading her that I'm if I met this person in real life, I probably would not want to linger around in her company. Harsh, but there you have it. So it's a good Gothic classic. I'm glad I read it, but it also wasn't going to be a new favorite book for me. All right, now we are up to my 4-star read. This was also kind of a surprising 4-star read for me, and that is Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. I kind of have a hit or miss relationship with V.E. Schwab's books. When I read the Shades of Magic trilogy, I started out really liking it, and then by the end I was really frustrated by it. It seems like every other book of V.E. Schwab's that I read, I switch, whether it's a positive or a negative time for me to read. So the last book of hers that I read was Gallant, which was a young adult book that was kind of a Gothic reimagining of The Secret Garden. Did not like it at all. This book is this is another 500-page tome that follows 3 queer women vampires across timelines. One, Maria, her story begins in the 1500s in Spain. Charlotte's story begins in the early 19th century in England and then London. And then Alice is in the sort of 20 teens in Boston in the United States. These characters are all connected not just by virtue of the sort of vampire parts of their story, but also by sort of a web of deeply messed up relationship dynamics and romance, but like romance with a lot of darkness in it. This is definitely like a hard M for mature vampire book, okay? Like, there is a lot of violence in it. This also deals with the sort of abusive relationship dynamics that can show up in queer relationships, not just in heterosexual ones. The book deals with what that kind of abuse looks like across the spectrum of different sexuality. And it also, you know, goes into those sort of classic vampire tropes of like, you can live forever, but at what cost? What are you actually losing in terms of your humanity? So I liked this book. I enjoyed reading it. It didn't really do anything particularly inventive or innovative when it comes to vampire stories, and I have seen some folks be a little bit more critical of that in their reviews, that they feel that this is already such a saturated genre. Why did this book need to be written and be like a 500-page tome? But I actually enjoyed it. I was pleasantly surprised that I had a good experience with this after really disliking the last of Schwab's books that I read. And it did make me want to go back and reread Carmilla, which is the like classic lesbian vampire novella that I was introduced to in my early booktube days. Obviously, that is like such a good book, really great. I think everyone should read and know about that book, but this was fun. And I haven't read like a sort of good vampire book like this in a little while, so I didn't really feel the tension of the like oversaturation of the genre. I think that I may have if I had slightly different reading habits. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I think that if you like vampire stories and you're fine with them not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but you're just looking for a good read, this is a good one to pick up. Okay, we're down to the final two books. These were both 5-star reads. One was a new release this year and one was a new to me author this year. So let's start with the new release. I think this is this is the second nonfiction book that I have for this wrap-up, because I forgot that The End of Education is also nonfiction. That is Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature by Patricia Ononiwu Kaishian. So this is kind of a nonfiction book that's exactly what it sounds like. The author is a mycologist, meaning she's a student of fungi and like lichens and other like fungal creatures. She is one of like a single-digit number of people that specializes in the particular fungus she studies that grow on beetles, and they have a symbiotic relationship with them. And she's also queer, both in terms of like gender and sexuality. And so this kind of synthesizes some personal essays with her sort of scientific knowledge, her experience growing up in the upstate New York sort of woodland areas near like the Adirondacks, the Hudson Valley, etc., which is a place that I know and love quite a lot. And I just absolutely adored this book. I thought the writing was impeccable on a sentence-by-sentence level. I learned so many new things about nature and wildlife, and also just like the strange queerness of nature, of things in nature. Like, I think some of us are maybe aware of things like the gay penguins in the Central Park Zoo, or the fact that there are certain fish that can change their gender depending on like population type things, or I guess change their sex would be more appropriate. Fish don't really have gender. But I just learned so many new things about how much more sexually diverse the natural world beyond humans is, and humans are pretty diverse, you know, when it comes to the ways that we can all like individually describe ourselves, but also the ways in which human sexuality is not as straightforward as like XX and XY, as people often say when they're referring to like the sex chromosomes and stuff. So this was just like this beautiful exploration and celebration of curiosity about the natural world and like what it means to be queer in nature, and like situate yourself within the context of something that is, you know, more like you than you may think. So absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5. And then a total surprise from a new to me author was A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. I absolutely loved this book. I got this from the library, and at some point I will be purchasing a copy because I really want to reread it and keep it on my shelves. But this is a fun, like maybe upper middle grade to young YA novel, but I think you could enjoy this at all age levels. It's a story of a young wizard girl named Mona. Her magical abilities are that she is good at telling like dough for bread, cakes, and cookies how to behave and using her magic to do that. So she is not your stereotypical fireball hurling wizard. She can make like her sourdough starter come to life. She has like a little gingerbread cookie that she bakes and comes to life and kind of marches around and can do things for her. And she doesn't necessarily see herself as being particularly powerful or significant, but she does get caught up in a plot that one of the like Duchess's advisors in the city where she lives is starting to concoct against people who can do magic. So against her will, she's kind of caught up into these events and these circumstances beyond her control as a magic user. And this is kind of the story of her growing into her confidence, both as a caster, but also as somebody that can affect change at the political level within her community. This is also a great meditation on, I think, an experience that many of us have when we're growing up. Like when you are a kid, you kind of think that adults have things figured out and that they are in charge and capable. And then as you get older, you sort of start to realize that no, in fact, most of them are just making things up as they go along, or being more like actively hostile to other groups of people than you may have originally thought. And then you kind of have this realization that you're never really ready, so to speak, to kind of grow up and become an adult and take that action with that autonomy until you actually start to take those actions. And that kind of marks a transition from like childhood to everything that lies beyond. This book also has a very strong anti-authoritarian message, which was something that I really appreciated reading right now, especially because this book really made me feel a lot of hope about the ways in which those of us who are not people in positions of, you know, whether it be elected power or whether it be like royals, like in this fantasy setting, those of us who are just kind of normal, ordinary people that are going about our everyday lives actually can do things to affect change and to resist tyranny and oppression. And I think like we just really need those stories as a species, but right now in particular, we need those stories because we need to be able to remember how to hope. We need to be able to remember why it is important to resist these types of regimes. And I think we also need the humor in a story like this. This is a story that is very sweet and funny and does have like a dark edge to it, which is why I might say it's like upper middle grade. Because it does go to some darker places, but I think there's just a level of optimism inherent in Mona's story. It reminded me a lot of one of my other favorite books that I read earlier this year, which was Isabella Nag and the Pot of Basil by Oliver Darkshire. That was kind of a similar, you know, unlikely heroine who was a woman in her 40s that kind of life had overlooked. She had not had the best life that she had always dreamed of, but she was able to kind of work magic and finds herself being the person where the buck stops, I guess, for lack of a better word. And it does show that like each of us, no matter how powerful we think we are or aren't, really does have power to affect change in ways that might be bigger and more meaningful than we could ever realize in the moment. I absolutely loved this book. Like I said, read this with the kids in your life. Read this just period in your life. It's so awesome. This was my first full-length T. Kingfisher that I read as well. I read the two Sworn Soldier novellas that are out currently, and I know that she has like more of a reputation now as a writer of horror, but what I didn't realize was that she had written so many books for kids and like younger readers. So definitely gonna look out for those too. I'm basically making my way through her entire back catalog thanks to my library for hooking me up with all those titles. But yeah, couldn't recommend that book more. I absolutely adored it. Okay, this is now ridiculously long, probably one of the longest wrap-ups I have ever filmed. So I am not gonna dilly-dally here too much longer. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching this insanely long wrap-up. I really appreciate having you here. You can subscribe if you want to get updated every time I post a new video, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.